Chapter 1: The Echo of Erasure. The heavy scent of expensive wax and stale champagne clung to the tapestries, a suffocating reminder of a celebration Nyla had only witnessed through the crack of a doorway. Her knees pressed into the cold marble of the great hall as she moved the damp cloth in rhythmic, practiced circles. Every sweep of her arm was an exercise in disappearance, a silent vow to remain part of the architecture. To the highborn wolves of the Silver Sky Pack, she was less than the dust she scrubbed away. She was a ghost in a maid's tunic, an omega whose very existence was a clerical error in the Book of Moon. Above her, the golden chandeliers flickered with a dying light, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced across the polished floor. Two she-wolves from the Alpha's inner circle sauntered past, their silk gowns whispering against the stone like mountain vipers. One deliberately caught the heel of her stiletto in Nyla's bucket, splashing gray, sudsy water across the girl's trembling hands. Nyla didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she lowered her chin until her forehead nearly touched the wet floor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why did the air feel so thin whenever they looked at her? It was because she had learned long ago that visibility was a death sentence, and survival meant being a shadow. The mockery followed the women as they moved toward the terrace, their laughter sharp enough to draw blood. Nyla felt the sting of their insults, words like gutter trash and spiritless, but she tucked them into the hollow spaces of her chest where she kept all her pain. Her nervous system was a finely tuned instrument of submission, vibrating with the instinct to flee even as her body remained frozen in service. She wondered if the moon goddess ever looked down at the basement of the palace, or if the light only reached the thrones. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden chill rippled through the hall, one that had nothing to do with the draft from the open windows. The announcement had been pinned to the central bulletin earlier that evening. The Luna ceremony was officially 7 days away. The Alpha King, a man whose name was spoken only in reverent whispers or terrified gasps, was finally claiming his queen. Nyla stared at the dark stain on the rug she was cleaning, a strange, localized heat blooming in her palms. Something was shifting in the ley lines of the pack, a tension that made the very stones of the palace seem to groan under a new weight. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to drown out the sudden, phantom sound of a wolf howling in the back of her mind, a wolf she was told she didn't possess. If she stayed small, she would be safe. If she stayed hidden, the coming storm would pass her by. But as she reached for her bucket, she noticed her own reflection in a shard of broken crystal on the floor, and for the first time in years, the girl staring back looked like a stranger waiting for a signal. Chapter 2: The Midnight Collision. The corridors of the North Wing were a labyrinth of obsidian and silence, reserved for the Alpha King's private quarters. Nyla knew she shouldn't be here this late, but the head housekeeper had demanded the hallway sconces be polished before dawn. She worked in the dark, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of wolf heads that lined the walls. Her breath hitched as she turned a sharp corner, her mind drifting to the rumors of King Kael's ruthlessness. They said his shadow could kill a man and his gaze could freeze a heart mid-beat. A sudden, violent surge of electricity hit her before she even saw him. It wasn't a physical blow, but a psychic tidal wave that crashed into her sternum, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. She stumbled, her cleaning rags fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. In the dim moonlight, a towering figure emerged from the gloom. Alpha King Kael stood like a monolith of dark power, his presence so immense it seemed to warp the space around him. Nyla's instinct screamed at her to vanish, but her legs had turned to lead. Their eyes met for a fraction of a heartbeat. His were the color of a winter storm, swirling with a predatory intelligence that pinned her to the spot. Before she could drop to her knees in the required bow, his hand shot out to steady her, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of her forearm. The contact was a lightning strike. A searing white-hot heat erupted at the point of touch, radiating upward through her veins and igniting a fire in her soul she never knew existed. Kael recoiled as if burned, a low, guttural snarl vibrating in his chest. a sound that was half warning and half agony. Nyla collapsed into a frantic crouch, her forehead hitting the stone with a dull thud. "Forgive me, Alpha. I didn't see. I am nothing, please," she rasped, her voice cracking with a terror that tasted like copper. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the king's ragged breathing. He didn't move. He didn't strike her. Instead, she felt the weight of his stare burning into the back of her neck, a gaze that seemed to be peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed invisibility. Why was his wolf pacing so loudly that she could hear it? "Get out!" Kael finally commanded, his voice a jagged edge of ice and steel. "Remove this thing from my sight before I lose my patience." Nyla didn't wait for a second order. She scrambled to her feet and fled into the darkness, her heart echoing the frantic rhythm of a trapped animal. Behind her, she could hear the sound of Kael's fist slamming into the stone wall, a crack of thunder that signaled the breaking of a long-standing peace. Fate had peered into her hiding spot, and now the darkness no longer felt like a sanctuary. Chapter 3. The Fragile Illusion. The grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory grace as the elite of the Silver Sky Pack gathered to toast the inevitable. From her position behind a towering floral arrangement, Nyla watched Serena, the high-born daughter of the Northern Duke, command the room. Serena was everything Nyla was not: radiant, golden, and loud. She moved with the confidence of a woman who knew the crown was already hovering over her head. Every time Serena laughed, a dull, aching throb pulsed behind Nyla's ribs, a sensation of profound wrongness that she couldn't rationalize. Nyla's job was simple: circulate with the tray of crystal flutes and never make eye contact. Because she was an Omega, she was supposed to be immune to the pheromones of the elite, yet the air in the room felt thick and syrupy, clogging her senses. She found herself tracking King Kael's movement across the raised dais. He sat on his throne like a god carved from granite, his expression unreadable as Serena leaned in to whisper in his ear. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man enduring a slow execution. A sudden crash echoed through the ballroom as a clumsy server dropped a platter, drawing a sharp, condescending look from the guests. Nyla took the opportunity to slip toward the service entrance, her chest tight with an emotion she refused to name. It wasn't jealousy. It was a visceral grief, as if she were watching someone else live her life. Her body recognized the scent of cedar and ozone drifting from the king, a scent that whispered of home and ancient promises. How could a cleaner feel a bond with a king? It was a madness born of exhaustion and the trauma of her upbringing. As she reached the safety of the kitchens, the head butler blocked her path, his face a mask of stern duty. "You've been reassigned, Nyla," he said, his voice devoid of empathy. "Since you're so good at staying out of the way, you'll be the primary cleaner for the Luna ceremony hall. You start at dawn." The news hit her like a physical weight. The ceremony hall was the most sacred space in the kingdom, the place where the bond would be sealed forever. Nyla nodded, her gaze dropping to her worn leather shoes. She was being sent to the heart of the storm, tasked with preparing the altar for the woman who would take the place Nyla's soul claimed was hers. As she walked back to her cramped quarters in the cellar, she passed a mirror in the hallway. This time, she didn't just see a reflection. She saw a flicker of amber light in her own pupils, a spark of defiance that suggested the seal on her heart was beginning to crack. The ceremony wasn't just a wedding, it was a ticking clock, and Nyla was running out of shadows to hide in. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Knee. The air in the Luna ceremony hall tasted of ancient dust and the suffocating sweetness of white lilies, a scent that felt like a funeral shroud to Nyla's heightened senses. High above, the vaulted ceiling arched like the ribcage of a stone giant, trapping the whispers of the workers as they draped silk over the altar. Because the ceremony was only days away, the tension in the palace had curdled into something sharp and jagged. Nyla moved through the shadows of the pillars, her scrub brush biting into the pads of her fingers as she attacked a stubborn stain on the dais. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, hoping that if she scrubbed hard enough, She could erase the memory of the king's touch from her skin. "Lower," a voice drawled, cutting through the silence like a silver blade. Nyla froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Serena stood at the base of the stairs, flanked by two high-ranking warriors who looked at Nyla with the casual boredom one reserved for an insect. The future Luna was draped in furs that cost more than Nyla would earn in 10 lifetimes, her golden hair caught in the sunlight filtering through the stained glass. Serena stepped forward, her designer heel grinding into the very spot Nyla had just cleaned, leaving a dark, muddy smear. Nyla didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the dirtied marble as she felt the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. "I apologize, my lady," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell of itself. She reached out to clean the mess, but Serena's foot shifted, pinning Nyla's hand to the cold stone. The pain was immediate and dull, but the shame was a blinding white light. Serena leaned down, her perfume, a cloying mix of jasmine and dominance, overwhelming the room. "An Omega who can't even keep a floor clean is a blemish on this kingdom," Serena hissed, her voice low enough that only Nyla could hear the venom. "Kneel properly, girl. Show the nobles how a dog greets its betters." Behind her, the doors to the hall swung open, and the heavy, rhythmic tread of the Alpha King echoed against the walls. Nyla felt Kael's presence before she saw him. It was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that made every cell in her body vibrate with a terrifying recognition. He stopped several paces away, his shadow falling over Nyla's huddled form. The silence that followed was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room as everyone waited for the king to speak. Nyla kept her head bowed, her hand still trapped under Serena's heel, praying for the floor to open and swallow her whole. She waited for a reprimand, for a defense, for anything that proved he saw her as a living being. But Kael remained a statue of ice, his scent of cedar and storm clouds swirling around her like a taunt. He stayed silent, his golden eyes tracking the scene with a cold, detached intensity that broke something deep inside Nyla's chest. Because he said nothing, the humiliation was complete. She wasn't just invisible, she was discarded. Chapter 5. The Hunter and the Ghost. The moon hung like a jagged bone in the sky as Nyla slipped out of the servants' entrance, her breath hitching in the frigid night air. After the public shaming in the hall, her skin felt too tight for her body, a feverish restlessness driving her away from the crowded quarters of the palace. She needed the silence of the forest, the only place where the hierarchy of the pack didn't feel like a noose around her neck. She moved with a ghost's grace, her feet finding the familiar deer paths that led deep into the ancient pines. Why did her chest ache with a phantom limb syndrome, as if a part of her soul had been severed and left behind on that marble floor? Deep in the woods, she stopped by a frozen creek, the ice cracking under the weight of her grief. She leaned against a silver birch, her fingers digging into the bark until her knuckles turned white. She had spent her whole life trying to be small, trying to be nothing. Yet the king's silence had hurt more than Serena's heel. It was a betrayal of a bond she wasn't supposed to have, a rejection of a connection that defied every law of their kind. As she stood there, a low rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the ground, the sound of a heavy beast at full gallop. A massive black wolf burst through the underbrush, its fur the color of a starless night, and its eyes two burning embers of molten gold. It was the Alpha's wolf, a creature of pure myth and primal terror. Nyla's instinct for self-preservation failed her. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She simply watched as the beast skidded to a halt, its chest heaving, steam rolling off its powerful shoulders in the moonlight. The wolf let out a low, mournful whine that sounded dangerously like a plea, its snout twitching as it caught her scent. "Go away," Nyla whispered, her voice trembling as she backed into the shadows of the trees. "I am nothing to you. Leave me in the dark." The wolf stepped closer, its massive paws crushing the snow, and for a second, Nyla saw a reflection of her own loneliness in those golden depths. It was an impossible moment. The king's soul seeking out the very girl he had allowed to be humiliated hours before. She realized then that Kael's silence wasn't indifference. It was a war. He was hunting her even as he tried to erase her, his wolf rebelling against the crown he was forced to wear. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air from the direction of the palace, signaling the Alpha's guard was searching for their king. The black wolf froze, its ears pinning back as it let out one final haunting howl that echoed through the valley. It turned and vanished into the trees as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Nyla alone in the freezing silence. Her heart was no longer her own. It had been claimed by a monster who couldn't love her, and as she walked back toward her prison, she knew that avoiding him was no longer a choice. It was a battle for her sanity. Chapter 6: The Blood on the Moon. The atmosphere in the servants' quarters had shifted from weary to terrified overnight as whispers of the purge began to circulate through the laundry rooms. It started with a missing Omega from the kitchens, then a young boy from the stables whose tunic was found shredded by the eastern gate. Someone was targeting the lowest members of the pack, a political shadow play designed to destabilize the king before his coronation. Nyla felt the walls closing in, the palace she once considered a neutral cage now feeling like a slaughterhouse. She kept her hood pulled low, moving through the servant tunnels with a frantic speed, her senses on high alert. She was delivering fresh linens to the guest wing when the shadows behind the tapestries shifted with a lethal intent. 3 men, their faces obscured by dark masks, stepped into the corridor, the silver of their daggers gleaming in the torchlight. They didn't speak. They moved with the synchronized precision of trained assassins. Nyla dropped the basket, her heart doing a frantic dance against her ribs as she backed away. "I have nothing," she stammered, her voice failing her. "I am just a cleaner." "You are a message," one of them growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. He lunged, the blade whistling through the air inches from her throat. Nyla dived behind a heavy oak table, the wood splintering under the force of their attack. She was cornered, the narrow hallway offering no escape, and her own wolf too buried under layers of trauma to offer any defense. Just as the lead assassin raised his blade for a final strike, the heavy iron doors at the end of the hall exploded off their hinges. A blur of gray and black fur tore through the room with a ferocity that defied the laws of nature. It wasn't the king's wolf this time, but Kael himself in his human form, his eyes glowing with an unearthly light. He moved faster than the eye could follow, his hands becoming lethal weapons as he intercepted the attackers. The sound of snapping bone and the wet thud of bodies hitting stone filled the air, a brutal symphony of protection. Kael didn't just fight, he decimated, his rage a tangible force that made the very walls tremble. When the last assassin lay crumpled on the floor, Kael turned toward Nyla, his chest heaving and his knuckles slick with blood. He looked like a god of war standing in the ruins of a temple. He reached out a hand to her, but stopped just inches from her face, his fingers trembling with a restrained violence. "They touched you," he rasped, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "They dared to lay hands on what is mine." Nyla stared at him, the terror of the attack replaced by a far deeper fear. The fear of being seen. If the king's enemies were targeting her, it meant the secret of their connection was no longer a secret. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a target, a political liability that could bring the entire kingdom to its knees. As the palace guards flooded the hallway, Kael pulled her to her feet, his grip possessive and fierce. The ceremony was only 2 days away, and as the moon rose higher, Nyla realized that the girl who wanted to be invisible was gone, replaced by a woman who was the center of a brewing war. Chapter 7: The Gilded Cage of Protection. The heavy oak door of the servants' quarters groaned as it swung shut, but it wasn't the click of a latch that Nyla heard. It was the heavy metallic slide of a deadbolt. 2 massive sentinels from the Alpha's personal blackguard stood like stone gargoyles outside her room, their arms crossed over chests armored in boiled leather. Kael had claimed it was for her safety, yet the stone walls of her tiny chamber felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Why did the air in the palace suddenly taste like ozone and impending lightning? It was because the king's obsession had finally overridden his politics, and Nyla was the prize in a game she never asked to play. Inside the room, the scent of cedar and expensive spice lingered, a ghostly trail left by the Alpha King during his brief, silent visit an hour prior. He hadn't spoken. He had simply paced the small square of rug, his eyes tracking her every breath with a predatory hunger that made her skin prickle. Nyla sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers tracing the rough weave of the blanket as she tried to reconcile the monster who killed assassins with the man who had almost touched her cheek. The confusion was a physical weight in her stomach, a knot of longing and terror that threatened to unravel her. "Eat," a voice commanded from the shadows of the doorway. A young maid, her eyes wide with a mixture of envy and fear, set a silver tray on the wooden crate that served as Nyla's table. This wasn't the thin gruel usually reserved for the Omega staff. It was roasted venison and winter berries, the food of the highborn. Nyla stared at the feast, her throat tightening until she could barely swallow. Was this the price of being noticed? To be fed like a prize hound while the rest of her kind were hunted in the streets? As the night deepened, the silence of the wing was broken by the distant, rhythmic chanting of the elders in the cathedral. They were preparing the lunar oils, the ancient resins that would bind Kael to Serena in less than 48 hours. Nyla pressed her hands over her ears, trying to drown out the sound of her own destiny being signed away. She felt a strange, phantom heat blooming in her marrow, a vibration that seemed to harmonize with the chanting. Something was waking up inside her, a dormant power that rattled against the cage of her ribs, demanding to be recognized. If she was just a cleaner, why did the moon seem to be calling her name? Chapter 8. The Breath of the Storm. The storm hit the palace with a violence that shook the very foundations of the mountain, wind howling through the battlements like a pack of vengeful spirits. In the chaos of the blizzard, the torches in the hallway flickered and died, plunging the north wing into a thick velvet darkness. Nyla stood by her window, watching the snow bury the world in white, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. A sudden click signaled the door unlocking, but it wasn't the guards. It was a shadow, taller and broader than any man she knew. Kael stepped into the room, his cloak dusted with snow and his presence filling the small space until there was no room left for oxygen. He didn't move toward her, but the tension between them was a physical bridge, a live wire hum that made the hair on Nyla's arms stand up. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the howling wind. "The council, Serena, they are watching every move you make." Kael took a single step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight, his eyes glowing with a feral golden light that pierced the gloom. "Let them watch," he rasped, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Nyla's very bones. "Let them see the king go mad." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her throat, the heat radiating from his skin like a furnace. For a heartbeat, Nyla considered running, considered screaming for the guards, but her body betrayed her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as his thumb traced the line of her jaw. The contact was an explosion of sensory data, the scent of rain, the rough texture of his calluses, and a sudden blinding vision of two wolves running through a forest of fire. The intimacy was more terrifying than the assassin's blades, a vulnerability that stripped away her armor of invisibility. Kael's hand moved to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there in the dark, two broken pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit the world they were born into. "I can't stop it, Nyla," he murmured against her skin, a confession that tasted like salt and regret. "The bond, it's tearing my wolf apart." Nyla felt a tear slide down her cheek, a drop of liquid grief that vanished into his cloak. She wanted to tell him that she felt it too, the pull, the ache, the soul-deep recognition. But the words were trapped behind years of silence. If she spoke the truth, she would be destroyed. If she stayed silent, he would belong to another. As the thunder shook the palace once more, she realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the war inside the king's heart. and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. Chapter 9. The Crimson Revelation. The morning of the penultimate day arrived with a chilling clarity, the snow-covered grounds of the palace reflecting a sun that offered no warmth. Nyla was escorted not to the kitchens, but to the royal library, a place she had only ever entered to wax the floors. The High Elder, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment, sat behind a desk piled high with genealogical scrolls. Kael stood by the window, his back to the room, his hands clenched behind him in a grip that suggested he was holding back a hurricane. "Look at the script, child," the elder commanded, his voice as dry as the paper he held. He pointed to a lineage map that predated the Silver Sky Pack, a complex web of names written in a language that seemed to glow under Nyla's gaze. As her eyes moved over the ink, the symbols began to shift and dance, rearranging themselves into a story she somehow already knew. It wasn't just a map, it was a mirror. There, at the base of a forgotten branch, was a mark that matched the birthmark on the small of her back, a crescent moon entwined with a silver thorn. The realization hit Nyla with the force of a physical blow, making her knees buckle. She wasn't an Omega born to serve. She was a descendant of the lost lunar line, a bloodline so powerful it had been hunted into extinction centuries ago. Her wolf hadn't been missing. It had been magically suppressed, a seal placed on her soul by someone who wanted her to stay invisible to stay alive. "You carry the blood of the first queen," the elder whispered, his eyes wide with a terrifying reverence. "The only blood capable of truly stabilizing an Alpha King's dominance without destroying him." Kael turned then, his expression a mask of raw, bleeding hope and jagged fury. He had known, or at least suspected, but seeing it written in the ancient ink made the danger absolute. Nyla wasn't just a girl he loved. She was a political weapon that every rival pack would kill to possess. If the council found out, they wouldn't just stop the wedding. They would execute her to prevent the shift in power. The secret was a crown of thorns, and it was already drawing blood. A sudden commotion erupted in the hallway, the sound of Serena's high-pitched command cutting through the library's silence. The future Luna had found them. Nyla looked at the scrolls, then at the king, and then at the door, the walls of her reality crumbling around her. She was no longer a shadow, but the sun around which the entire kingdom was beginning to orbit. As the doors burst open, Nyla felt the first true crack in her internal seal, a low, melodic growl echoing in the back of her mind. The Omega was dead, and the Queen was beginning to stir in the wreckage of her heart. Chapter 10. The King's Investigation. The scent of ancient parchment and floor wax normally grounded Nyla, but today, the Royal Library felt like a pressure cooker. Kael stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette a dark, jagged tear against the blinding white of the snow-covered grounds. He didn't look at the High Elder. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if he could see the approaching storm of the Council's wrath. Behind him, the Elder's fingers trembled as they traced the faded ink of a scroll that hadn't been unrolled in 3 centuries. "It is undeniable, my king," the Elder whispered, his voice cracking like dry autumn leaves. "The lineage is pure. The lunar seal on her soul wasn't an accident, it was a survival mechanism." Nyla stood in the center of the room, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized tunic to hide their shaking. She felt like an intruder in her own life, a girl who had spent 19 years scrubbing floors only to be told she was a living relic. Why did the truth feel like a death sentence instead of a promotion? It was because she knew that in the world of alphas, rare things were rarely loved. They were colonized. Kael turned slowly, his winter storm eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat. The conflict in his expression was a raw, bleeding wound. He wanted to pull her into his arms and claim her before the world, yet the crown on his head was a heavy golden shackle. "If the council learns of this," Kael rasped, his voice vibrating with a protective fury, "they won't see a woman. They will see a battery, a way to anchor their own power through you." He walked toward her, his heavy boots silent on the plush rug, and stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out, his hand hovering near her temple, his fingers twitching with the urge to touch. Because he was the king, he had to be a strategist, but because he was her mate, his wolf was screaming to burn the world down to keep her safe. Nyla looked up at him, her vision blurring with unshed tears, realizing that the man who had ignored her in the hall was now the only thing standing between her and a gilded cage. Chapter 11. The Shattered Seal. The midpoint of the week arrived with a celestial alignment that made the very air hum with static. Nyla was back in her small room, but the walls no longer felt like stone. They felt like skin. The heat in her marrow had escalated into a localized sun, a rhythmic pulsing that synchronized with the beating of the palace's heart. She clutched the edge of her cot, a sudden sharp pain lancing through her skull as a memory that wasn't hers exploded in her mind. A woman with her eyes screaming as a silver collar was snapped around her neck. "Nyla!" a voice barked, followed by the heavy thud of her door being kicked open. It wasn't Kael, but Serena, her face a mask of aristocratic rage. The future Luna held a crumpled piece of parchment, the Elder's notes. Behind her, 2 guards stood with their heads bowed, clearly terrified of the woman they were sworn to serve. Serena lunged forward, grabbing Nyla by the hair and forcing her head back until her neck felt like it would snap. "You think you can steal a throne with a drop of old blood?" Serena hissed, her breath smelling of bitter almonds and spite. "You are a cleaner, a mistake, a dog who found a diamond in the trash." As Serena's hand tightened, something inside Nyla finally snapped. The seal on her soul, worn thin by years of suppression and ignited by the proximity of her mate, shattered with the sound of breaking glass. A wave of pure silver light erupted from Nyla's skin, throwing Serena across the room like a rag doll. Nyla fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her vision shifted. The world was no longer gray and dull. It was a vibrant tapestry of scents and auras. She could see the fear in the guards' hearts, the rot in Serena's soul, and the ancient sleeping power of the mountain beneath them. She wasn't just an Omega anymore. She was a predator who had been asleep for a long time. Serena scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with a murderous realization. The secret was out. The invisible girl was gone, and in her place stood a threat that no amount of scrubbing could ever erase. Chapter 12. The Choice of Shadows. The palace was in an uproar, the scent of panic drifting through the ventilation shafts like smoke. After the incident in her room, Nyla had been moved to a high-security holding cell beneath the throne room, a place reserved for political traitors. She sat on the cold stone floor, her newly awakened senses recording every footstep, every whispered conspiracy in the halls above. She knew what was coming. The council would demand her execution or her forced mating to a puppet of their choosing to secure the bloodline. The door to her cell opened with a mournful creak, and Kael stepped inside. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deep by a night of arguing with the elders. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the damp and the dirt, his hands reaching out to cup her face. "I have a carriage waiting at the southern postern," he whispered, his voice thick with a desperation she had never heard from a king. "My most loyal guards will take you across the border. You can disappear, Nyla. You can be the shadow again." Nyla looked into his eyes, seeing the sacrifice he was making. If she stayed, he would have to fight a civil war to keep her. If she left, he would have to marry Serena to maintain the peace, losing his soul in the process. "And what happens to you?" she asked, her voice steady for the first time in her life. Kael didn't answer, but the way his grip tightened on her jaw told her everything. He would be a king of ashes, reigning over a kingdom that had traded its heart for stability. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She had spent her life wanting to be seen, and now that she was, the only way to save the man she loved was to vanish forever. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, her heart breaking in time with the ticking clock of the ceremony. "I won't let you become a ghost," she murmured, even as she made the silent decision to walk into the night. She would leave, not because she was small, but because her love was finally big enough to handle the darkness. As she stood up to follow him to the escape route, the moon hit the high window of the cell, casting a silver path that looked suspiciously like a trap. Chapter 13. The Echo of Footsteps. The stone corridors of the subterranean exit felt like the throat of a great beast, damp and smelling of ancient earth. Nyla moved through the darkness with a newfound fluidity, her senses vibrating with the hum of the palace's hidden life. Kael led her by the wrist, his grip a searing band of possessive iron that seemed to be the only thing anchoring her to the physical world. Every few yards, he stopped, his head tilting as his apex hearing tracked the movements of the sentries patrolling the floors above. Because the council was already suspicious, every shadow held the potential for an ambush, and the silence between them was a heavy, suffocating shroud. "The horses are staged past the ravine," Kael whispered, his voice a jagged rasp that grazed her skin in the narrow passage. He pulled her into a recessed alcove as a squad of armored boots thundered overhead, the vibration rattling the dust from the ceiling. Nyla looked at the back of his neck, seeing the tension in his powerful shoulders. A king reduced to a smuggler for the sake of a girl he was supposed to ignore. Why did the air feel like it was thickening into lead? It was because the bond was reacting to the distance she was about to put between them, a psychic tether that was beginning to fray and bleed. As they reached the heavy iron grate of the southern postern, Nyla stopped, her feet rooting to the muddy floor. The realization that she was about to step into a world where he didn't exist hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. She watched him struggle with the rusted lever, his muscles bunching under his tunic, a man who would give up his soul to keep her breathing. "Kael," she breathed, the name tasting like a prayer and a goodbye on her tongue. He turned, his winter-gray eyes fractured with a raw, agonizing desperation that stripped away every bit of his royal composure. He didn't speak. He simply crushed her against his chest, his face burying in the crook of her neck, as he inhaled her scent of rain and starlight. Nyla wrapped her arms around him, her fingers digging into the heavy wool of his cloak, trying to memorize the rhythm of his heart against her own. They stood at the edge of the world, two broken souls caught in the gears of a destiny that demanded their separation. If she stepped through that gate, the light in his eyes would go out forever, and she would become a ghost, haunting the borders of a kingdom she was born to rule. Chapter 14. The Fragile Vow. The freezing wind of the mountain pass whipped Nyla's hair across her face as she stood on the threshold of the forest, the carriage a dark, hulking shape in the tree line. Kael stood before her, the moonlight catching the silver embroidery of his doublet, making him look like a tragic figure from a forgotten myth. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a heavy obsidian signet ring, pressing it into her palm with a force that bruised her skin. "If anyone stops you, show them this," he commanded, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that terrified her. "My loyalists will recognize it. They will die before they let the council touch you." Nyla looked down at the ring, the crest of the silver sky pack glinting with a cold, mocking light. She felt the weight of his history, his power, and his heart resting in her hand, a burden she never asked for but could no longer refuse. "You're going back to her," she whispered, the thought of Serena standing at the altar beside him feeling like a serrated blade in her gut. Kael flinched as if she had struck him, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing for the path he had to walk. Because he was the Alpha, his life was a sacrifice to the pack, but because he was a man, he was drowning in the grief of her departure. "I am going back to a throne of thorns, Nyla," he admitted, his voice dropping to a low, melodic growl that vibrated in her marrow. "But every breath I take will be a lie until you return. I will marry the shadows and bed the silence if it keeps you safe from their greed." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead in a chaste, devastating promise that felt like a brand. The intimacy was a suffocating blanket, a reminder of everything they were losing before they even had a chance to claim it. Suddenly, a distant horn blast echoed from the palace battlements, a sharp, urgent signal that the king's absence had been discovered. The moment of peace shattered like glass under a hammer. Kael shoved her toward the carriage, his eyes turning a feral, luminous gold as his wolf clawed at the surface of his skin. "Go!" he roared, the command vibrating through the trees and sending a murder of crows into the night sky. Nyla scrambled into the seat, her heart shattering in time with the cracking of the driver's whip, leaving the only man she had ever loved standing alone in the dark, a king without a crown, a mate without a soul. Chapter 15. The Traitor's Trap. The carriage jolted over the frozen ruts of the mountain road, the sound of the wheels a rhythmic funeral dirge in Nyla's ears. She huddled in the corner of the velvet-lined interior, clutching Kael's ring so tightly the metal bit into her skin. She was free, yet she felt more imprisoned than she ever had in the cellar of the palace. Why did the shadows outside the window seem to be lengthening, stretching toward the carriage like skeletal fingers? It was because the escape hadn't been a secret. It had been a calculated move by a predator far more patient than the king. A sudden, violent jolt threw Nyla to the floor as the carriage screeched to a halt, the sound of horses screaming in terror filling the air. She scrambled to the window, her breath hitching as she saw the circle of torches illuminating the snow-covered clearing. These weren't Kael's loyalists. These were the Duke's men, their tabards emblazoned with the weeping willow of Serena's house. At the center of the line stood Serena herself, mounted on a white mare, her face twisted into a triumphant, ugly sneer that made Nyla's blood run cold. "Did you really think he could hide you from me?" Serena called out, her voice amplified by the silence of the woods. "The king is a fool for love, but I am a woman of ambition. You aren't leaving this kingdom, Omega. You're going back to the palace to watch me take everything you thought was yours." Nyla felt a surge of cold, biting fury erupt in her chest, the lunar power in her blood reacting to the threat. She stepped out of the carriage, her head held high for the first time in her life, the obsidian ring flashing in the torchlight. The guards moved in, their silver-tipped spears leveled at her heart, but Nyla didn't flinch. She saw the fear in their eyes, the way they hesitated to touch a woman who carried the king's mark and the scent of ancient power. "Touch me," Nyla challenged, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with a command she didn't know she possessed. "Touch me and see what happens when the moon finally claims its own." Serena's laughter was a jagged shard of ice, but as the guards closed the circle, Nyla realized she had been framed as a traitor, a runaway thief who had stolen the king's seal. She was being dragged back to the altar not as a queen but as a sacrifice to the very woman who wanted her dead. Chapter 16. The Iron Procession. The rhythmic clanking of silver chains was the only sound that pierced the oppressive silence of the high-security transport. Nyla sat upright on the wooden bench of the armored carriage, her wrists bound by heavy manacles that hummed with a low anti-shifter frequency. The metal bit into her skin, suppressing the silver fire in her blood and leaving her feeling hollow, like a bell with its clapper removed. Outside the barred window, the jagged peaks of the mountains watched her return to the palace, not as a ghost, but as a trophy of Serena's treachery. Why did the stone walls of the fortress look like gravestones in the morning mist? It was because the hope she had felt in Kael's arms had been a hallucination, a cruel trick played by a fate that demanded her suffering. As the carriage rolled through the main gates, the crowd of gathered nobles parted like a dark sea. Nyla could feel their eyes, heavy with judgment and stained with a morbid curiosity, pressing against the glass. They didn't see a woman who had been hunted. They saw a thief who had seduced a king and tried to flee with his crown. Serena rode at the head of the procession, her chin tilted at an angle of supreme triumph, her white mare stepping daintily over the slush. The spectacle was a carefully choreographed execution of Nyla's dignity, a public stripping of the humanity she had only just begun to claim. The carriage doors were wrenched open by guards wearing the Duke's colors, their faces masks of cold indifference. Nyla stumbled as she was hauled onto the cobblestones, her legs weak from hours of confinement and the psychic drain of the silver bindings. She looked up at the balcony of the throne room, searching for the one face that could tether her to reality. Kael stood there, a silhouette of frozen grief, his hands gripping the stone railing so hard the rock began to spiderweb under his strength. He looked down at her, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning, but the distance between them was an ocean of political necessity that neither of them could cross. "The prisoner will be held in the high tower until the commencement of the ceremony," a herald announced, his voice echoing through the courtyard like a gavel. Nyla was dragged toward the spiral staircase, her heels dragging against the stone, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. The trauma of her childhood, the years of being told she was replaceable, a mistake, a nothing, had returned to claim its throne. If the man who called her his mate could only watch as she was paraded in chains, then the belief she had fought so hard to kill was finally proving itself true. She was only meant to be a footstool for the powerful. Chapter 17. The Silence of the King. The high tower was a cage of glass and gold, offering a panoramic view of the kingdom Nyla was never meant to have. She stood by the window, the sun setting behind the pines and casting long, bloody streaks across the horizon. Below the palace was a hive of frantic activity as the final preparations for the lunar ceremony reached a fever pitch. The scent of roasting meats and expensive wine drifted up on the wind, a sickening reminder of the celebration that would cement her erasure. Kael had not come for her. The hours had bled into a day, and the silence from the royal wing was a physical blow, a confirmation that the king had chosen his crown over his soul. "He won't come, you know," a voice said from the doorway. Serena stood there, draped in a gown of liquid silver that seemed to shimmer with a predatory light. She held a vial of dark liquid in her hand, the ceremonial oil that would be used to anoint the new Luna. She walked toward Nyla, her footsteps silent on the silk rug, her presence a suffocating cloud of jasmine and malice. "He is an alpha, Nyla. His first duty is to the pack, and the pack demands a queen who brings stability, not a relic of a deadline that brings war." Nyla turned, her eyes dull and shadowed, the fire that had erupted in her room now nothing but cold ash. "You framed me," she whispered, her voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "You took the ring." Serena laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that lacked any trace of warmth. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning Nyla's face with a clinical detachment. "Of course I did. And Kael believes you took it to sell to the Western Pack. He thinks your love was a ruse to escape your station. Why else would he be sitting in the council chamber right now, signing the marriage contracts?" The words were a poison that seeped into Nyla's veins, turning her blood to ice. The betrayal felt absolute, a total collapse of the fragile bridge they had built in the dark. If Kael believed she was a traitor, then the bond was a lie, a biological glitch that meant nothing in the face of suspicion. She felt her inner wolf curl into a ball of misery, retreating into the deepest recesses of her mind. Because she had allowed herself to hope, the fall was terminal. Serena reached out, patting Nyla's cheek with a mocking affection that made her skin crawl. "Tomorrow, you will stand in the wings and watch me take the oath. And then, you will be disposed of, a footnote in a history that won't even remember your name." Chapter 18. The Final Descent. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, the air heavy with the scent of an approaching blizzard. Nyla was dressed in a simple, coarse linen tunic, her hair left unadorned, a stark contrast to the opulence of the great hall. She was led to a small roped-off area near the side of the altar, a place designed to force her to witness every second of her own destruction. The hall was packed with the elite of the werewolf world, their voices a low, buzzing hive of gossip and anticipation. At the center of the dais stood the high priest, his silver robes flowing like moonlight, his hands holding the ancient Book of Rites. Kael emerged from the shadows behind the throne, dressed in black and gold, his face a mask of such profound suffering that even the nobles fell silent. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution, his eyes fixed on the floor, his aura a jagged, chaotic storm of suppressed rage. He didn't look at Nyla as he took his place at the altar. He didn't even acknowledge her presence when the priest began the opening invocation. The lack of eye contact was the final nail in the coffin of her heart. The king had accepted the lie. He had accepted the darkness. "Does any wolf stand against this union?" the priest asked, the traditional question hanging in the air like a challenge. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the remaining hope from Nyla's lungs. She saw Serena standing at the back of the hall, ready to make her grand entrance, a vision of stolen power and lethal ambition. Nyla felt the weight of her childhood abandonment fully settle over her shoulders, a familiar, crushing coat of lead. She realized then that she was exactly where she had always been. On the outside, looking in at a warmth she was never allowed to touch. The music began, a haunting, rhythmic drumming that signaled the bride's approach. Nyla bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with a silent, broken sob she refused to let escape. She stepped back, moving toward the shadow of the pillar, her body automatically performing the gesture of surrender she had practiced since she was a child. She made herself small. She made herself nothing. "I was never meant to be chosen," she whispered to the cold stone floor. As Serena began her walk down the aisle, the hall plunged into a sudden, unnatural chill, and for a moment, the world held its breath, waiting for a heart to stop or a soul to break. Chapter 19. The Fractured Soul. The great hall felt like a tomb, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the stagnant weight of tradition. Nyla stood in the recessed shadow of a marble pillar, her head bowed so low that her hair shielded her face from the flickering torchlight. Every beat of the ceremonial drums felt like a hammer striking the raw nerves of her chest. Because she had finally accepted her erasure, the world had become a blur of gray and silver, a silent movie where she was merely a prop. Why did the stone floor feel like it was vibrating? It was because the ancient foundations of the palace were reacting to the catastrophic misalignment of the stars, a king about to bind himself to a lie. Across the vast expanse of the hall, Kael stood at the altar, a monolith of gold and obsidian. His back was to her, but the psychic weight of his presence was a physical pressure against Nyla's skin. She could feel his wolf howling in the back of his mind, a soundless, agonizing scream that echoed in the marrow of her bones. He looked like a man made of glass, held together by nothing but the rigid requirements of his crown. The high priest raised the silver chalice, the moonlight from the clear-story windows catching the rim and casting a cold, mocking halo over the dais. "Before the moon and the blood," the priest intoned, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that filled every corner of the hall. "We prepare to seal the bond of the king." Nyla squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers digging into the rough linen of her tunic until her knuckles turned white. She felt the tether between her and Kael stretching, thinning, and beginning to snap. The pain was a localized supernova in her solar plexus, a spiritual amputation that left her gasping for air. Because she was making herself small, the bond was dying, and as it withered, the light in the room seemed to dim, as if the sun itself were being eclipsed by her grief. Suddenly a vision exploded behind Nyla's eyelids, a flash of Kael's face, not as a king, but as the man who had held her in the dark. She saw his memory of her, distorted by Serena's whispers, a fractured image of a girl he thought had betrayed him. But beneath the suspicion, she felt his raw, bleeding love, a primal force that refused to be extinguished by politics. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. His fear of being abandoned had created the very abandonment he dreaded. He wasn't choosing Serena. He was choosing a slow suicide because he thought Nyla had already left him in his heart. Chapter 20. The Awakening of the King. The ceremony reached the moment of anointing, the point of no return where the Alpha must call his Luna forward to share the blood oath. Serena stepped onto the first tier of the dais, her gown shimmering like a snake's scales, her hand reaching out for Kael's with a possessive, predatory grace. The hall held its breath, the silence so absolute that the flickering of the torches sounded like the flapping of wings. Kael hesitated, his hand hovering over the silver bowl, his entire body trembling with a restrained violence that made the nobles in the front row recoil. "Alpha," Serena whispered, her voice a sharp, urgent needle of command. "Take my hand. Claim your kingdom." Kael's head snapped toward her, but his eyes weren't seeing the woman in silver. They were staring through her, focused on a point in the shadows that only his wolf could perceive. A sudden, visceral growl erupted from his chest, a sound so primal and ancient that it shook the chandeliers. The mate bond, pushed to the brink of destruction, had finally surged back with a vengeful power, flooding his system with the scent of rain, starlight, and the truth. He saw it then, the way Serena's aura curdled with malice, and the way the girl in the shadows was fading into nothingness. He realized that the ring hadn't been stolen. It had been a lure, a trap designed to make him kill the only part of himself that was still alive. His fear of losing Nyla had blinded him to the fact that he was the one throwing her away. "No," Kael rasped, the words sounding like a tectonic plate shifting deep beneath the earth. He pulled his hand back from Serena as if she were a leper, his winter storm eyes igniting with a lethal, golden brilliance. The high priest faltered, the chalice trembling in his grip. "My king? The ritual must be completed. The stability of the pack—" Kael didn't let him finish. He turned toward the hall, his presence expanding until he seemed to tower over the room, a god of storm and fury unleashed. "The pack is built on a lie," he roared, his voice cracking the stone of the altar. "There is no stability in a kingdom that asks its king to murder his own soul." He stepped off the dais, his gaze scanning the crowd with a terrifying precision, searching for the shadow he had tried to erase. Chapter 21. The path through the crowd. Nyla felt the shift in the air before she understood what was happening. The heavy, suffocating pressure of the ceremony had snapped, replaced by an electric tension that made her skin hum. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw Kael descending the stairs, his golden eyes locked onto her hiding spot with an unbreakable focus. The nobles scrambled out of his way, a sea of silk and fur parting before his righteous anger. He moved like a hunter who had finally found his prize, his pace increasing until he was almost at a run. "Nyla!" he called out, the name sounding like a victory cry and a desperate apology all at once. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her legs shaking, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. She looked small, broken, and weary, but to Kael, she was the only point of light in a world of darkness. Serena's voice shrieked from the altar, a jagged sound of ruined ambition, but the king didn't even flinch. He reached the roped-off section where Nyla stood and tore the velvet barrier away with a single violent motion. He stopped inches from her, his chest heaving, the scent of cedar and ozone so thick it was a physical embrace. "I saw you bow," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that broke her heart. "I saw you try to disappear. I let you believe that I didn't see you." He reached out, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made the entire hall gasp. The contact was a revelation, a flood of shared memories and whispered truths that burned away every lie Serena had told. The council members began to rise, their voices a rising tide of protest, but Kael didn't look back. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against Nyla's, his wolf purring a low, melodic rhythm of belonging. "You are not a cleaner," he murmured against her skin, his words carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "You are not a mistake. You are the heartbeat of this mountain, and if they want a queen, they will have to accept the one the moon gave me." As he took her hand and began to lead her toward the altar, Nyla felt the last of her trauma begin to dissolve, replaced by a fierce rising power that suggested the ceremony was only just beginning. Chapter 22. The Altar of Truth. The walk toward the dais felt like walking through a dream made of liquid gold and jagged glass. Kael's hand was a crushing, protective heat around Nyla's fingers, his stride so purposeful it seemed to pull the very air from the lungs of the noble witnesses. Silence fell over the great hall, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was punctured only by the rhythmic thud of the king's boots. Serena stood on the top step, her face a contorted mask of ivory rage, her fingers clawing at the silk of her skirts as if she could shred the reality unfolding before her. Because the betrayal was so public, the atmosphere was a powder keg, one spark away from a civil war that would paint the marble red. "Stop this madness, Kael!" the Duke roared from the front row, his hand flying to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "You are parading a thief and an Omega before the sacred bowl. This is sacrilege!" Kael didn't even turn his head, his golden eyes fixed on the high priest who stood trembling with the silver chalice. He led Nyla up the stairs, forcing Serena to stumble backward to avoid being trampled by his momentum. He stopped at the very center of the altar, the place where the sun hit the stone, and turned Nyla to face the kingdom. He didn't look like a man making a mistake. He looked like a man finally waking up from a nightmare. "You call her an Omega because you are blind to the light she carries," Kael announced, his voice a thunderclap that rattled the stained glass windows. "You call her a thief because you fear what she truly owns. But I tell you now, look at her. Really look at her." He reached out and grabbed the silver collar of Nyla's tunic, tearing it open to reveal the glowing crescent mark on her collarbone. Suddenly, the air in the hall began to hum with a low-frequency vibration that made the crystal chandeliers chime. Nyla felt a violent, white-hot pressure building behind her eyes, the last of the magical seals on her soul melting like wax in a furnace. A blinding flash of lunar silver erupted from her skin, a shockwave of pure energy that sent the high priest stumbling and knocked the ceremonial candles to the floor. Inside her mind, the silent girl finally screamed, and a massive, snow-white wolf with eyes of burning amber tore through the darkness of her psyche. The transformation wasn't a struggle, it was an explosion, a homecoming of a power that had been buried for 1,000 years. Chapter 23. The Sovereign's Choice. The Great Hall was no longer a place of politics. It was a sanctuary of primal power. Nyla stood beside Kael, her human form draped in a shimmering aura of silver light that made her coarse linen tunic look like a gown of woven stars. Her wolf was no longer a secret, its presence vibrating through the room and forcing every alpha in the crowd to lower their gaze instinctively. The Omega was gone, replaced by a Luna whose bloodline predated the very stones of the palace. Because the truth was undeniable, the Duke's sword stayed in its sheath, his face pale with the realization that he had tried to execute a goddess. Kael turned to her, his expression a mixture of awe and a deep, soul-shattering relief. He didn't demand her submission. Instead, he did something that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the assembly. The Alpha King, the man who knelt to no one, dropped to one knee before the former cleaner. He took her hand, pressing his forehead against her knuckles in a gesture of absolute surrender. "My Luna does not bow," he whispered, his voice carrying through the silent hall with a raw, emotional weight. "She is the sun that guides my storm. She is the crown I choose." Nyla felt the lifelong knot of abandonment in her chest finally unravel, replaced by a sense of belonging so profound it felt like breathing for the first time. She reached down, her fingers tangling in Kael's dark hair, and gently urged him to stand. She didn't want him at her feet. She wanted him at her side. As he rose, he turned to the crowd, his arm sliding around her waist in a possessive, unbreakable curve. "The ceremony is over," he declared, his voice echoing with a finality that brooked no argument. "The Queen has returned, and if any wolf dares to question her place, they will answer to the King's claw." Serena tried to speak, a desperate, shrill sound of ruined pride, but the guards, the very men who had served her family, stepped forward and blocked her path. They had seen the silver light. They had felt the true bond. They moved with a new loyalty, escorting the Duke and his daughter from the hall as if they were nothing more than common intruders. The rebellion hadn't been crushed with blood. It had been evaporated by the sun. Nyla looked out over the sea of bowed heads, her gaze no longer low, her heart no longer small. She was the anchor of the kingdom, and the man beside her was finally whole. Chapter 24. The Moonlit Echo. The months that followed were a blur of reconstruction and healing, a slow thawing of the winter that had gripped the Silver Sky Pack for generations. Nyla walked through the great hall, her silk robes whispering against the marble she used to scrub on her hands and knees. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the light of the palace, a queen whose mercy was as legendary as her power. Because she remembered the cold of the cellar, she made sure the fires in the servants' quarters never went out. And because she remembered the weight of a lowered gaze, she taught her people to look at the sky. She found Kael on the private terrace, his silhouette framed by a massive, luminous moon that seemed to hang lower just for them. He was staring out over the mountains, his expression peaceful in a way it had never been when he was alone. Nyla stepped up beside him, her hand finding his in the dark, their fingers interlocking with a familiar, effortless heat. "You're thinking about the first time we met," she murmured, a playful edge to her voice that only he was allowed to hear. Kael chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in her chest and pulled her closer into his side. "I'm thinking about how lucky I was that you were a terrible cleaner," he teased, his eyes dancing with a wicked, loving light. "If you hadn't been there that night, I would still be a king of shadows." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of cedar, rain, and a future that was no longer a gamble. The intimacy was a steady flame, a physical manifestation of a bond that had survived the furnace and come out as tempered steel. They weren't just partners in a throne, they were two halves of a single ancient soul that had finally found its way home. As they watched the moon rise, a young Omega girl walked past the terrace doors, her head bowed as she carried a heavy tray of laundry. Nyla stopped her with a gentle word, reaching out to lift the girl's chin with a soft, steady finger. "Look up, child," Nyla whispered, her eyes glowing with a faint silver warmth. "The moon shines for everyone, not just the alphas. Never make yourself small for a world that is lucky to have you." The girl's eyes widened, a spark of hope igniting in her pupils as she nodded and walked away with a straighter back. The cycle was broken. The shadow was gone. And as the wolves of the Silver Sky Pack began to howl in a harmonious, silver chorus, the queen stood beside her king, her gaze fixed on a horizon that was finally beautifully bright.